What's up, everybody? Peter Exosocofer here, and welcome to another episode of the Personal Branding Video Show. Today, we're doing the one and only Rick James. Um, yeah, I had to do Rick because he's a different, he's passed now, different guy. He made a lot of mistakes in his life, but I think he's considering, he spent time in jail and everything else. They're doing a very good job of branding Rick. Obviously, focusing on his music. I hear Nelson George has just got a documentary on Thriller, the 40th anniversary of Michael Jackson's Thriller, and so that's about to hit. I think Showtime and one of the streaming services, if I'm not mistaken, Paramount Plus. But check that. And again, he's focusing on the music too, because Michael's is a little, um, you know, um, his legacy's a little complicated to say the least. But in the last year or two, a documentary on Rick James, Bitchin, The Sound and Fear of Rick James, was released. So it went to Showtime, and now it's on one of the streaming services. Did a very good job of that. And so I'm kind of basing that off of, that's clearly a an attempt to rebrand. I wouldn't even say rebrand Rick James, but put everything in proper perspective, because they did not, let's just cut to the chase. I mean, Rick spent about 2 years in the '90s in jail for, um, I you know kidnapping, bondage, burning a woman with a crack pipe with his girlfriend at the time. Uh, yeah, I don't. Those were the charges: kidnapping and sexual assault and sexual abuse. Uh, yeah, but he spent 2 years. In the video, they don't you know deny it. They don't relitigate it. They're just kind of like, yeah, this happened. They speak about it. They don't dwell on it. But it's like, yeah, this happened. But let's focus on the music and let's focus on who Rick James really was. Rick branded himself and his music as punk funk, which is interesting because in the documentary Sound and Fury, I mean, they talk about Rick and how he borrowed a little bit from new wave, and I think they play some new wave and then Super Freak, and they hey, look at this, they used the synthesizer patch that was used in new wave. New wave was came out of punk, so yeah, but Rick's music really wasn't punk. I mean, I think with Rick, I mean, he was out of the funk, but he had a punk mentality and a punk attitude, and he just didn't give a damn. I mean, Rick was a true bad boy and did whatever he wanted to do, and really did not. Um, I mean, to be blunt about it, he was just like, hey, society's rules don't apply to me. And, he did end up going to jail, because of that. But he took his medicine and, didn't really complain about it. So yeah, so punk funk. The interesting thing, hey, I'm a Prince fan. I love Prince. Big rivalry though between Prince and Rick James, and for a while there they kind of branded off each other. So from late 1979 to 1980, Prince opened for Rick James. Rick James was promoting the Fire Up album, and Prince was promoting his second album. So yeah, that's where they cross paths, and that's where it gets interesting. For me, the most interesting thing of Rick James's music, though, is how he uses strings and synthesizer strings. He didn't. By that time, you can get some really good strings. Particularly, well, I mean, in the early '80s, later in his career, I thought Roland did really good strings. But back in the day, the late '70s and early '80s, um, Prince and and Rick James both used the ARP Omni, which was a string synthesizer. So, and Prince used strings well, but nobody used strings like Rick James. In many ways, Rick James married funk up with classical music. And you're talking about "Dance with Me," "Give It to Me, Baby," uh, little 17. Talked about punk funk earlier. 17, a great song about having sex with a 17-year-old, a minor. But the strings then, Rick would use strings in the chorus, and the strings in that chorus were great. Glow's another one where Rick really used the strings well. Yeah, but Rick being the bad boy was 17. And that's really what sets Rick apart. I mean, the closest ones when it comes to using strings to me would be Nights in White Satin by the Moody Blues, and the Righteous Brothers did Unchained Melody and You've Lost That Loving Feeling. I mean, those are the closest. I mean, Rick was just a master at using the strings. He was really good. So, Prince versus Rick James. So for the Controversy album, this is post, that tour of the Rick James, Prince. No, I'm sorry, Dirty Mind. So Prince's third album, Dirty Mind, he dubbed himself the Rude Boy. So if Rick was going to do punk funk, then Prince is going to be the Rude Boy. And actually, interestingly enough, I mean, in the Peach and Black podcast, which is totally devoted to Prince, they argue in the episode that they did, jointly with the Prince podcast. I mean, they argue that, and those guys are out of Australia, that the Dirty Mind was essentially a punk album, even though it was funk. And I can see that it was just so radical and so pushing back at the boundaries when it came to sexuality. So I mean, so it's interesting that Prince, because Rick was more the rude boy. And if you go watch Dave Chappelle's show, and Rick was every skit where Dave Chappelle plays Rick is rude. So it's ironic that Prince takes Prince does the more punk album, but Rick is punk funk, and Prince decides to be the rude boy. Prince could be. I mean, go back and look at the Dick Clark. Prince got that very early in his career when he was on the show, and he got a little, you know, people got on him for being rude to Dick Clark. Well, Prince basically froze up and didn't know what to say. Usually asked him questions, and Prince just one word answers and whatnot. So, but it's interesting. Yeah, but the Prince, Rick James intersection's fun. So, I'm gonna grab my notes here because I don't want to forget anything. So, number one. So when they were touring, I guess Rick James was kicking around the idea of having a girl group. Well, Prince came up with Vanity Six first, and then, Rick followed with the Mary Jane Girl. So Rick says Prince, stole that idea from him. Who knows? Like both groups though, so it's all good. Here's the big one that a lot of people don't know. I think it was the 1982 American Music Awards. Guess who Rick James showed up at the awards with? Vanity. Well, we know how that had Prince and Vanity ended up being a thing and whatnot. So the plot thickens. And my favorite Rick James Prince song. So after they toured together, um, Rick stole all of Prince's synthesizers. This, yep. I guess Prince and his people were better at programming the synthesizers than Rick's people were. So I don't, so he used them for his next album and then returned them. Now I've heard that the album was street songs, but I'll have to look at the chronological format of Rick's albums, but hilarious. I mean, I get Prince could have sued, he could have whatever, but that's just kind of, you know, funny, if you ask me. And it, you know, it's kind of epic as far as that rivalry goes. The other big claim that Rick James, lobs at Prince is that he stole his live act, which Prince, it was so much tension between the two bands. So Prince would uh, take all of Rick's calls and everything just to get under Rick's skin, and then Rick would do them, and later in the tour, the audience would laugh at him because the audience thought Rick was copying Prince when Prince took all his cat calls and his call and response, from the crowd and did that, himself. And so, Rick was pissed at Prince and claimed that, he's the reason Prince became such a great live artist. Now, I'm still working on, Rick James as a live artist. Uh, there's actually the earliest Prince live concert I could find is on YouTube out of Lakeland, Florida, and it's off of that tour. And take a listen to it. You know, Prince is still working the revolution. I mean, Andre Simone's still in the band, and I forget the name of his first keyboardist, but she's still in the band. I mean, Wendy and Lisa, nor Lisa are there yet, and Dez is there. So, but Prince admitted, and the band members admitted that first tour or two, they were whipping each other. Prince was whipping them into a good brand. Now, the interesting thing, the Controversy tour, go find the Capitol Theater tour there, concert there from the Controversy tour. I mean, I think it's only 18 months after the Lakeland tour, and that's, they're an elite band by that time. Um, yeah, but but it's interesting, and so if you go to on the streaming services, street songs, and listen to Rick's live, his best live performance from the Street Songs tour, and you compare that to the Lakeland, that Prince early concert. I mean, it's about what and what. But if you can compare the Controversy, that Capitol Theater tour to Street Songs, I mean Rick or Prince by a year and a half later is a much better performer than Rick James. I don't know if um, what Rick would was his goal. To put it's interesting that many people say that Prince stole the show from you know Rick James as the opening act, but a couple years earlier, Rick James opened up for P Funk and George Clinton. My guys, number two on my list. But by that time, you know, drugs and the band had started splintering as far as P Funk goes, and people were leaving P Funk. But a lot of people have said who went on that tour said Rick James stole the show from P Funk. So it's very interesting, the nexus between these three. Uh, and in some ways, I think live Rick tries to emulate. I guess is trying to explain Rick's live sound. I think he tries to emulate the P Funk live sound, which is interesting because I mean the P Funk and eventually I'm going to do an episode all things music on jam bands, but I mean P Funk is a jam band, and you know about half the guys in the band at any time, particularly when they roll with the entire crew. I mean, the last 10 years, sometimes they do small clubs and bring a ten person band, and other times they bring you know 20, 25, 30. And when P Funk is running 20, 25, 30 strong, about half of those folks you know are borderline, if not jazz musicians. And so he was trying to Rick James seems to me was trying to emulate P Funk, but without jam musicians. And so the beauty of P Funk is the music is organized chaos that really cannot be replicated. Well, I mean, in many ways, jazz, if you look at jazz, it's organized chaos. I mean, yes, it's, you know, but I mean, it's the ultimate expression of freedom, and P Funk's a little bit like that. So he took the jazz element out of it, and sometimes, you know, but one of these days, maybe I'll you know, get, you know, get settled on Rick James. I think the last time I listened to that Street Songs live concert, I appreciated it a little more. And you know, I actually got to see Rick now, you know, in 2005, I believe it was, the early 2000s, a couple years before he died. Interesting lineup. So Vaught opened up, and it was when he was just breaking out. Rick James came on next. The third act was Al Green, and the closing act was Mary J. Blige. Yeah, interesting lineup. Yeah, and Al Green took to, you know, played longer than he should have, and Mary J. wasn't real happy. But I mean, Al Green was Al Green. You know, he was the elder. Totally different story, but yeah, it was a great concert. But I mentioned that concert because Rick James is still up there calling, derogatory, homophobic slurs at Prince, starting with F, and so he never got over it. And Tina Marie, which of course she was very close to Rick and kind of Rick's protege, and also became very close with Prince. Just said that you know. Rick could never get over that tour, and she said she thought Prince respected Rick's music, but just didn't respect Rick as a person because I mean he was crude and you know could be an asshole just to be blunt about it. But anyway, yeah. So let's talk about Rick in prison because hey, this is branding, and he branded had this impediment in his you know his blot on his brand and his career. So a lot of people don't know this, but Rick, went into the Navy in the late '60s and left. And so he was a draft dodger. He went to Canada for a while, and he ended up serving 1 year in prison for dodging the draft. The Vietnam draft. And he did ultimately, in the '90s, serve 2 years for false imprisonment, kidnapping, torture, and rape, I think were the words used um, of this woman and his girlfriend, 2 years in prison for that. So, in the documentary, they allude to it. Um, they don't, like, this happened. They don't try to relitigate it. They don't make excuses for it. I mean, even some of his band members, like I seen Rick do some crazy stuff, when it came to sex and some of the orgies we attended. So, I mean, the one thing that the documentary does is it does lean into Rick's wild side, and that's the punk funk side. That's why he coined that term punk funk. The one thing the documentary does is it sort of tries to portray, um, Rick James as a political activist, mainly because of his fight, because he did sue MTV because they wouldn't play the Super Freak video, and early on in MTV they would not play black artists their videos at all, and MTV said their audience this is as a rock audience, even though they were playing new wave and white pop artists, they said they don't our audience does not want to you know hear or see R&B or funk or whatever. I mean, Rick Ghetto Life was political off of the Songs album, and actually some of his later stuff. I'm talking about in the 2000s was pretty political and pretty insightful. I mean, Rick. I mean, sometimes these artists sometimes make their best music, when they're out of the when their time has passed, and Rick, his last two or three albums are really good stuff, and he did some pretty his views on race is pretty interesting and pretty good. um, but yeah, but I don't think you know, overall, at least, in his prime, Rick wasn't all that political. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, that's, again, as I said, that's not going to happen. But, in the documentary, they don't say, oh, Rick doesn't need to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. His music stands the test of time and is good enough anyway. But that's the attitude that the documentary takes. And I think it's a good attitude. And I think, it's silently defiant of the fact that he's not going to get in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The attitude is, we don't need the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for, Rick James's uh, legacy to live on. And I think they accomplished that. And that's one of the reasons why, I'm kind of doing this episode. So, yeah, Rick James, complicated legacy. Uh, they're focused on the music when it comes to that legacy. I mean, it's a shame he won't get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He's based on the music. I think he should be there and he deserves it. But you know, his daughter's on there who's grown now and talks about growing up around him, and Rick doesn't. The music speaks for itself. Michael Jackson, as I said earlier. You know, um, the new documentary on the 40th anniversary of Thriller. I mean, it's already showing that regardless. I mean, Michael has a complicated legacy, but his the music's going to survive, and Rick's there too, and I think it's a pretty honest accounting of Rick. I mean, you can be rebellious and live through Rick, but don't do some of the things Rick did. Is kind of, I mean, the message there in that documentary. But it's honest. Doesn't sugarcoat the legal issues or whatnot. And hey, I mean, we all have bad moments in life, and no one's perfect. So you have to figure out how to brand that stuff. And usually, I was just thinking before this episode. I mean, who has had the best rebrand out of all? Well, I mean, I don't, Don King is controversial, the boxing promoter, but he spent time in jail for murder, and he talks about he loves America and yada yada yada, and made a lot of money. I mean, a lot of people think he's a con man and a shyster, but if I would have to, a lot of people don't remember, Ray Lewis early in his career at the Baltimore Ravens had an issue at the Super Bowl one year where he attended, and there was a shooting, and somehow I don't know if he ended up with a gun, but he was sort of an accomplice or an accessory for a while, and he had to hire a bunch of lawyers and whatnot. And this is when he was very very young at the beginning of his career. But needless to say, he is become an outstanding citizen. Learn from that situation, and you know obviously was a leader on that team, but still was respected, and and can speak on a lot of issues. So we all have our failings, and we all make our mistakes, and part of branding is learning how to um, climb out of those holes, so to speak. So I mean, what can Rick James teach about that? Well, first of all, own it. I mean, in that documentary, they don't try to. The one thing he didn't do that Ray Lewis did is he never really improved. I mean, he died, due to drugs. He came out, and his drug issues are well documented now. The other thing, ironically, I'm going way off script here because this just hit my mind. But in this era of legalized marijuana, well, Rick was the first one. I mean, outside of Black Sabbath, Sweet Leaf, I mean, he did Mary Jane, and he was the first, you know, you know, artist to put his love of marijuana on wax. Now, you mean later you had Dr. Dre and the Chronic. So, in this we love marijuana era, Rick James is a hero, and it's kind of funny because I remember 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago here in Indianapolis when we passed the religious. The RIFRA law, which is allowing religions to have more rights, and one of them so we opened up a church of cannabis, and I remember uh, one of the local news stations streamed their very first service, and the preacher there said, we're not going to spark up today, meaning light up the marijuana, because it's illegal. But boy, did they play some interesting. They weren't playing Amazing Grace. They had a band there, so it was Last Dance for Mary Jane, and that was the first song they played. And the second one was Rick James, Mary Jane. Now, I don't know if they got to Sweet Leaf by Black Sabbath, but those are, when I think of those are the three famous weed songs, I think of. And then, obviously there's the whole Dre Chronic album. But anyway, Rick, and it's funny if you can, if back, if you can hit and be kind of like Nostradamus on an issue and champion that issue, you can be a hero down the road. I mean, in some ways, Freddie Mercury and Queen and his sexuality was complicated for him. You know, for Gen Z, I mean, he's a hero because he was, that was a tough time in the '70s for the LGBTQ community, and then you know, so it's interesting how things, Rick Champion, weed back in the '70s is now, cool and even more progressive than it was back then. So anyway, interesting episode. Thanks for coming through. Enjoy doing Rick James. Um, got 5 albums on the all the streaming services here on my channel. Working on some singles. I'm hoping to get some out in the next 6 weeks. So, seeing how the singles do compared to albums, and I'll probably do a mix going forward of albums and singles. And plus, I'm doing some graphic or some visual art stuff, and I want to get that out to the public. And I'm not sure. I don't see myself doing the gallery thing, so I kind of want to use album covers, sort of like how P Funk did with Pedro Bell and Iron Maiden did with their guy. I can't remember who did the artwork for Iron Maiden back in the day. So yeah, I mean, I'm an artistic dude and opening up new avenues of my creativity, but I also want to share that creativity too. So anyway, thanks for coming through. 5 albums on all the streaming services right here as well. 2 science fiction fantasy novels on Amazon, and also a novella. And I will see you next episode, and thank you again.